The air was crisp with the scent of pine and freshly fallen snow as I packed the last of our bags into the trunk of the car. The Christmas lights twinkled in the early evening darkness, casting a soft glow over the suburban neighborhood where Daniel, Lily, and I had built our life, modest, comfortable, and filled with love. Yet, as I turned to see my husband locking the front door and my daughter clutching her stuffed rabbit with a hesitant expression, a familiar knot of unease twisted in my stomach. Wellington Hills. My childhood home. The grand estate that had once been my entire world, but had never truly felt like mine. I had long accepted my place in the Carter family, on the outskirts, an afterthought, the disappointment. Not that they ever said it outright, of course. No, the disapproval came in subtle ways. My father, Charles, with his scrutinizing gaze whenever I spoke, his careful avoidance of my married name, as if saying, Mrs. Olivia Carter, left a sour taste in his mouth. My mother, Eleanor, with her polite yet distant embrace, her carefully curated conversations that never included my accomplishments, but always highlighted those of my siblings. And Lily, my sweet, bright-eyed Lily. She had never complained, never asked why Grandma never spoke of her to friends, why Grandpa barely looked at her during family gatherings. But I saw it. I saw it in the way she clung to Daniel's hand a little tighter whenever we entered the grand mansion. The way her excitement dulled just a little whenever her cousins were showered with attention while she remained in the background. This was our annual pilgrimage into a world that had never quite accepted us. Daniel placed a hand on my back, his warm touch grounding me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. I let out a slow breath, forcing a smile. "It's Christmas." As if that alone was a reason. We drove in relative silence, the hum of the car's heater filling the space between us. Lily, in the back seat, swung her legs idly, her gaze fixed on the frosted car window. "Mommy," she said suddenly. "Do I really have to go?" I turned in my seat, my heart clenching at the hesitation in her voice. "Of course, sweetheart. It's Christmas with Grandma and Grandpa. We'll have fun, I promise." She nodded slowly, but her expression remained uncertain. We arrived at Wellington Hills an hour later, the wrought iron gates opening smoothly as we approached. The estate was as imposing as ever, the grand mansion illuminated in golden light, its sprawling gardens covered in a pristine blanket of snow. It was breathtaking, luxurious, everything my parents had worked to build, everything they took pride in. And yet, as I stepped out of the car, the coldness I felt had nothing to do with the winter air. The moment we entered, we were enveloped in the bustling world of the Carter household. Servants moved with precision, ensuring every detail of the Christmas celebration was perfect. The massive tree in the foyer glittered with expensive ornaments, a towering spectacle meant to impress. The scent of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon filled the air, a deceptive warmth that did nothing to ease my nerves. "Olivia," my mother greeted, her tone as poised as ever, pressing a brief kiss to my cheek. Her gaze flickered to Daniel, then to Lily, who stood quietly at my side. "You made it." "Of course," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Victoria and her family arrived an hour ago," she continued, as if our presence was merely another item on her checklist. "Natalie and Benjamin will be down shortly." And just like that, she turned, already moving toward the next guest, the next moment, as if our presence was nothing more than an obligation to acknowledge. Daniel placed his hand on my back again, a silent reassurance. I felt Lily shift beside me, gripping her stuffed rabbit a little tighter. The grand living room was filled with guests, extended family, and acquaintances my parents had deemed important enough to invite. Victoria, my eldest sister, was the first to approach. "Olivia," she said with a polished smile, air-kissing both my cheeks. "How's real estate?" "Busy," I replied, already bracing for whatever condescension would follow. "That's wonderful," she said, though her tone barely concealed her lack of interest. "You must be exhausted with all the small properties you handle." "I don't know how you do it." Before I could respond, Natalie, my second sister, arrived, her sharp eyes assessing everything as always. "Olivia," she greeted, then turned to Daniel. "Still in IT?" Daniel smiled, unaffected. "Still keeping the world running." Natalie nodded as if his work was a distant, irrelevant detail. Benjamin, my younger brother, entered the room last, his easygoing nature at odds with the rest of the family. "Olivia," he said warmly, pulling me into a genuine hug. "It's good to see you." "You too," I murmured, relieved. Dinner was a grand affair, the dining table stretching long enough to seat all the guests. Lily sat beside me, small and quiet, her gaze flickering to her cousins, who were receiving doting attention from my parents. The lavish display of affection, the way Eleanor smoothed Victoria's daughter's hair, the way Charles laughed at something Benjamin's son said, it was all so painfully familiar. And then there was Lily. Excluded, unnoticed, as if she simply didn't belong. She remained silent, picking at her food, her small shoulders tense. Daniel's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. The evening wore on, the conversations carrying on without us. My parents spoke proudly of Victoria's husband, the renowned surgeon, of Natalie's latest high-profile case, of Benjamin's upcoming lecture at a prestigious university. But not once did they mention me. Not once did they ask about my life, my work, my family. Not once did they acknowledge Lily. I had expected it, but somehow it still stung. As dessert was served, I glanced at my daughter. Her face was carefully neutral, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about my daughter. This was about the quiet hurt she swallowed, the way she shrank in a room that should have embraced her. I had spent my entire life trying to earn my parents' approval, trying to fit into a mold they had never designed for me. But I wouldn't let my daughter do the same. Lily deserved love. She deserved acceptance. And if my parents couldn't see that, if they refused to see her, then maybe it was time I stopped trying to force them to. Because I wasn't just their daughter. I was Lily's mother. And I would not let her be unwanted. Not anymore. The cold air hit my face as we stepped out of the grand estate, the golden glow of Wellington Hills spilling onto the freshly fallen snow. My fingers were wrapped tightly around Lily's small hand, her grip trembling as her tiny chest hitched with uneven breaths. Daniel was a step behind us, his jaw clenched, his silence heavier than words. I didn't turn around. I didn't give my parents the satisfaction of a final glance, of any acknowledgement beyond what had already transpired. Let them watch us leave. Let them sit in the silence they created. I opened the car door, guiding Lily into her seat. Her red sweater looked even smaller against the expensive backdrop of my parents' towering estate, the child-sized warmth of it stark against the cold grandeur of their world. I buckled her in gently, brushing damp curls from her tear-streaked face. "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured. "We're going home." She sniffled but didn't say anything. Daniel got into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel hard enough that his knuckles turned white. I could feel the anger radiating off him, simmering just beneath the surface. "Let's just get out of here," he muttered. I nodded. He started the car, the engine cutting through the winter silence, and we drove away from Wellington Hills for what I knew, deep in my heart, would be the last time. The drive home was quiet. Lily had fallen asleep somewhere between the city lights and the long stretch of open road, her tiny form curled up in the back seat, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. I kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, my chest tightening each time I saw the way her small brows furrowed, even in sleep. Daniel hadn't spoken much since we left. His hands were still firm on the wheel, his expression hard, his usual calmness nowhere to be found. It was only when we pulled into the driveway of our home, our real home, the one we built together, that he finally exhaled. He shut off the engine but didn't move to get out. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the snow-covered yard. "They humiliated her," he said quietly, his voice edged with something sharp, dangerous. "They humiliated our daughter, Olivia." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I know." He turned to me then, his dark eyes filled with barely contained fury. "And you didn't say anything." I flinched, not at his words, but at the truth in them. I hadn't said anything. Not when Eleanor smirked. Not when my father remained silent. Not when my daughter sat there, clutching an empty box while the other children reveled in their expensive gifts. I had simply stood, taken her hand, and walked out. I had always been good at swallowing my hurt when it came to my parents. Years of experience had taught me that reacting to their cruelty only gave them more power. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about Lily. And I had let them do this to her. I should have said something, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel exhaled, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. You took her out of there. That's what matters. I nodded, but the guilt didn't fade. We got out of the car, moving as quietly as we could to bring Lily inside. She stirred slightly as Daniel carried her, but she didn't wake. I followed them upstairs, watching as he carefully laid her down in her bed, tucking the blankets around her. She sighed in her sleep, her little fingers still curled around her stuffed rabbit. Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead before straightening, his gaze meeting mine in the dim light of her nightlight. She's too young to feel like that, he said softly. To feel like she doesn't belong. Tears burned at the back of my throat. I know. He reached for my hand, lacing our fingers together. We don't have to keep doing this, Liv. We don't have to keep going back there. I squeezed his hand, a slow, painful truth settling deep in my chest. We didn't. And we wouldn't. The next morning, the weight of the night before still clung to me like a second skin. I stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in my hands as the smell of pancakes filled the air. Lily sat at the breakfast table, her small fingers tracing patterns in the syrup on her plate. She wasn't crying anymore, but she was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel sat beside her, trying to coax her into eating more, but she only picked at the edges of her pancake. Hey, sweetheart, I said gently, kneeling beside her chair. How are you feeling? She shrugged. Okay. I glanced at Daniel, my heart aching at the uncertainty in her voice. Lily, I said softly, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. What happened last night? That wasn't your fault, okay? She hesitated, her little fingers tightening around her fork. But they don't like me. I inhaled sharply, forcing down the lump in my throat. That's not true. She looked up at me then, her big, sad eyes filled with something no 6-year-old should ever have to feel. Then why did Grandma say I don't need anything? I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Daniel's jaw clenched. I took a slow breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had. Grandma was wrong, I said firmly. You're loved, Lily. So much. By me. By Daddy. By the people who truly matter. She blinked up at me, as if trying to believe my words. Daniel reached across the table, his voice steady. Do you know what the best thing about Christmas is, kiddo? She shook her head. It's not the gifts, he said. It's the people you spend it with. And you have us. Always. Lily looked between us, something shifting in her small features. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was something. A step forward. She picked up a small piece of pancake and took a bite. Daniel squeezed my hand beneath the table, and I exhaled, my heart lighter than it had been in hours. We didn't need Wellington Hills. We didn't need their approval, their wealth, or their cold, conditional love. We had each other. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, as snowflakes drifted lazily outside, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting a message from Daniel or maybe a friend. Instead, it was from Natalie. You were right to leave. Mom and Dad went too far. We need to talk. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady but expectant. For the first time in my life, my siblings weren't blindly defending our parents. For the first time, I wasn't the only one seeing the cracks in the foundation of our family. Something was shifting. And this time, I wasn't afraid to let it. The house was quiet as I sat at the kitchen table, my phone resting in front of me like a ticking time bomb. Natalie's message stared back at me, the words carrying a weight I wasn't sure how to process just yet. You were right to leave. Mom and Dad went too far. We need to talk. For years, my siblings had danced around our parents' behavior, offering excuses, justifications, and half-hearted reassurances that I was simply overthinking it. But now, for the first time, there was no denial. No minimizing. They saw it. They saw what had been happening all along. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. The house was still, save for the soft humming of Daniel as he tidied up the living room. Lily was in her playroom, coloring quietly, still shaking off the emotional weight of the night before. I glanced back at my phone. If Natalie was reaching out, it meant something had changed. I tapped out a quick response. I'm free to talk now. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I hesitated for half a second before answering. Hello? Olivia. Natalie's voice came through, sharper than usual. I don't even know where to start. I closed my eyes. Then just start anywhere. A heavy sigh. Benjamin and we didn't know what happened with Lily until after you left. Victoria told us. And when she did, God, Olivia, I wanted to scream. I swallowed, waiting. Natalie wasn't the emotional type. She was precise, analytical. If she was speaking this way, it meant she was genuinely shaken. Mom actually smirked when she said it, she continued, voice tight with anger. Like it was some kind of twisted joke. And Dad? He just stood there and let it happen. It was disgusting. I had to force myself to stay quiet, to let her finish. Ben was furious. He confronted them, right there in the dining room, and do you know what they said? A bitter laugh. Mom told him, Lily isn't like the other children, Benjamin. She doesn't belong in our world. Olivia made her choices, and she has to live with them. My stomach twisted, even though I wasn't surprised. Like she's some kind of punishment, Natalie snapped. Like Lily isn't a sweet, wonderful child who just wanted to be included. I can't believe I've spent my whole life defending them. I rubbed my temple. You didn't know. Maybe not, but I should have. We all should have. A pause. I think I did know. I just didn't want to admit it. For a long time, I had resented my siblings for their blind loyalty to our parents. But now, listening to Natalie's voice, I understood something. It wasn't loyalty. It was fear. None of us had ever dared to challenge Charles and Eleanor Carter because to do so meant being exiled. Cut off. Forgotten. I had learned that lesson first. And now my siblings were learning it too. Natalie, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, what do you want to do about this? Cut them off, she said immediately. I've already spoken to Ben, and he agrees. No more paying for their medical bills, no more handling their legal work, no more fixing their investment mistakes. We're done. I sat up a little straighter. You're serious? As a heart attack, she said grimly. Ben and I crunched the numbers last night. You know that trust fund they've been dipping into? The one they pretend is still flush with old money. Yeah, I said, frowning. It's almost gone. That took me a second to process. Wait, what? They've been burning through it faster than we realized. Lavish parties, property taxes, keeping up appearances. And when that started drying up, guess what? They relied on us. The money Victoria's husband puts toward their healthcare, the legal work I've been handling for free, the investments Ben's been carefully balancing to keep them afloat. It's us, Olivia. We're the ones keeping their perfect little empire from collapsing. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to wrap my head around it. Charles and Eleanor Carter were not just wealthy, they were Wellington Hills royalty. Their lifestyle was a fortress built on power, influence, and carefully managed wealth. But if that wealth was gone, they need us, Natalie said, her voice calmer now. And for the first time, I'm realizing how much power we actually have. I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me. For so long, my parents had dictated the terms. They had decided who was worthy of their affection, their approval, their resources. But now, the balance was shifting. If my siblings were truly cutting them off, if they were no longer funding their lifestyle, then for the first time in their lives, my parents were about to experience something entirely foreign. Need. Dependence. And the one thing they had always held over my head, power, was slipping away. What about Victoria? I asked after a moment. Natalie sighed. She's on the fence. She knows what they did was cruel, but she's been in denial for so long, it's harder for her to break away. But she won't fight us. Not this time. I nodded, absorbing all of it. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. This was about decades of control. Decades of emotional manipulation disguised as high expectations. And for the first time, we weren't playing by their rules. All right, I said, voice steady. Let's do this. Natalie let out a breath, as if she had been waiting for my confirmation. I'll handle the legal side, she said. Ben will make sure their accounts are cut off from any of our funds. I'll talk to Victoria again, try to get her fully on board. And me? I asked. You've done your part, she said, softer this time. You walked away first, Liv. You showed us what was possible. I closed my eyes, emotion swelling in my chest. For years, I had carried the weight of my parents' rejection alone. But I wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Lily. As I hung up the phone, I glanced toward the playroom, where my daughter sat cross-legged on the floor, humming to herself as she colored. She looked up, her big, curious eyes meeting mine. Mommy, she asked, are you okay? I walked over, kneeling beside her, brushing her curls from her face. I'm more than okay, I whispered. We're going to have the best Christmas ever, Lily. Just the three of us. Her face lit up, a real, genuine smile breaking through the shadows of the past day. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the quiet house. It had been 3 days since we left Wellington Hills, 3 days since Natalie's call, and though I had tried to settle into the peace of our own home, my thoughts kept drifting back to my parents. Not out of longing, but out of a strange, undeniable curiosity. What would they do now? For as long as I could remember, Charles and Eleanor Carter had lived in a world of absolute control. They dictated the terms of every relationship in their lives. What was acceptable, what was beneath them, what was worthy of their attention. They had built their lives on a foundation of exclusivity, of wealth and reputation. And now, for the first time, they were facing something they had never experienced. Rejection. I poured a cup of coffee and stepped onto the back porch, letting the cold air clear my mind. Daniel was inside with Lily, watching one of her favorite animated movies, their laughter drifting softly through the kitchen window. That was what mattered. Not my parents. Not Wellington Hills. Not the life I had spent years trying to fit into. But then my phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. Natalie. I hesitated for only a second before answering. Hey. Liv, she said, exhaling sharply. It's happening. I straightened. What is? They're falling apart. A pause. I gripped the railing. Tell me everything. Natalie didn't hesitate. Ben cut off their access to any of his financial management services 2 days ago. And Victoria officially told them she won't be covering their medical expenses anymore. I filed legal paperwork that formally removes myself as their pro bono counsel. She sighed, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. And guess what? Mom called me this morning. I braced myself. And she was panicking. A bitter chuckle. She tried to act composed at first, like she was just checking in, but then she started hinting at the fact that some of their standing bills hadn't been paid. That she couldn't get through to their financial advisor. That Dad had a minor health scare last night, and they had to deal with it alone. I remained silent, letting it sink in. Alone. Charles and Eleanor Carter had never been alone in their lives. They had always been surrounded by people who admired them, respected them, catered to them. But admiration had its limits. And now that their children, their true lifeline, had walked away, they were discovering just how conditional their world had been. What did you say to her? I asked. Natalie's voice hardened. I told her the truth. That we were done. That if she wanted help, she could ask like a decent human being instead of expecting it like a queen on her throne. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. How did she take that? She hung up on me. A pause. But Liv, she sounded shaken. I've never heard her like that before. Neither had I. Growing up, Eleanor had been impenetrable. The perfect society wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect matriarch. Even in moments of quiet cruelty, she never lost composure. If she was shaken now, that meant something had truly changed. They'll come to you next, Natalie warned. Be ready. I glanced back through the kitchen window, watching as Lily giggled at something on the TV, curled up against Daniel's side. I murmured. It happened sooner than I expected. That evening, just as I was settling Lily into bed, the doorbell rang. Daniel met me in the hallway, his brows furrowed. You expecting someone? I shook my head, a cold sensation creeping into my stomach. I already knew. Daniel must have seen it in my face, because he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Do you want me to handle it? I hesitated. I wanted to say yes. But this was my battle to fight. No, I said, squaring my shoulders. I need to do this. He nodded, pressing a kiss to my temple before stepping back. I'll be right here. I moved toward the front door, inhaling deeply before pulling it open. And there they were. Charles and Eleanor Carter stood on my doorstep, looking more fragile than I had ever seen them. My mother's perfect blonde waves were slightly out of place, her makeup thinner than usual, as if she had lost the energy to keep up appearances. My father, always so meticulously groomed, looked older than I remembered. His expensive cashmere coat did little to hide the tired slump of his shoulders. They didn't belong here. Not in my world. And yet, here they were. Eleanor was the first to speak. Olivia. I didn't move. What are you doing here? She let out a slow breath, her eyes scanning mine. We wanted to talk. I leaned against the door frame. Now you want to talk? A flicker of something guilt, maybe, crossed her face. Yes. I didn't step aside. I didn't invite them in. For the first time in my life, I was the one with the power. And they knew it. Charles cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Your mother and I, he hesitated, forcing himself to meet my gaze. We didn't realize how much we. His voice trailed off as if saying the words out loud pained him. Depended on you. Needed you. I let the silence stretch, refusing to make this easy. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. Olivia, would you hear us out? I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening on the doorknob. Once upon a time, I would have given anything for this moment. For my parents to see me, to acknowledge the pain they had caused, to ask for something rather than demand it. But now, standing here, looking at them in their vulnerability, I realized something. I didn't need their apology. I had already built a life without them. But Lily. I thought of my daughter's innocent face, the way she had asked, "Are you sure they want me here?" This wasn't just about me. It was about her. I straightened. Fine, I said finally. I'll listen. But before you say anything, understand this, I lifted my chin. This isn't about you making amends with me. This is about Lily. Eleanor flinched. Charles exhaled, his expression unreadable. For the first time in their lives, they weren't in control. And they knew it. I stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Say what you came here to say. The moment Charles and Eleanor Carter stepped inside my home, the air shifted. My parents had always carried an aura of dominance, a quiet, unspoken demand for respect that could make even the strongest people shrink under their gaze. But now? Now, they looked out of place. Eleanor hesitated just past the threshold, glancing around my modest but warm home. It was nothing like the Carter estate, no crystal chandeliers, no marble floors, no curated perfection. Instead, there were framed family photos on the walls, Lily's drawings stuck to the fridge with colorful magnets, and a cozy living room where Daniel sat watching from the corner, arms crossed, silent but ever watchful. My father adjusted his coat, his movements slow, almost hesitant. The confidence that usually radiated from him was gone, replaced with something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. I shut the door behind them and turned, arms folded. Talk. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the hallway where Lily's soft humming could be heard from her playroom. She swallowed hard before finally looking at me. We've made mistakes, Olivia. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. That's one way to put it. Charles cleared his throat. Your mother and I, we didn't think, he stopped himself, jaw tightening. We were wrong. The words felt foreign coming from him. I arched a brow. Wrong about what, exactly? Eleanor took a slow breath. About you. About Lily. About, she pressed her lips together, shaking her head slightly, as if the weight of the words was too much. About everything. I didn't respond right away. I had imagined this moment 100 times over the years, my parents admitting fault, acknowledging the pain they had caused. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel satisfying. It didn't feel like enough. Because their regret, their sudden self-awareness, wasn't coming from love. It was coming from loss. Loss of control. Loss of power. Loss of the life they had built on the backs of their children. I stared at them, waiting for the inevitable justification, the inevitable excuse. And, right on cue, Eleanor sighed. We raised you to marry well, Olivia. To build a life worthy of the Carter name. And when you chose a different path, we thought, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. We believed you were making a mistake. Daniel, who had been silent up until now, let out a quiet scoff. A mistake? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. You mean, a mistake by choosing love over money? Eleanor flinched, but before she could respond, I stepped forward, my voice sharp. You didn't just disapprove of my choices, Mother. You erased me. You acted like I didn't exist. Like my daughter didn't exist. Silence. My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temple as if this conversation physically pained him. We were trying to uphold tradition, Olivia. The Carter name carries weight. We thought. You thought, I interrupted, that status mattered more than family. Neither of them denied it. I let out a slow breath, pushing away the anger rising in my chest. Why are you really here? Eleanor's gaze dropped, shame flickering across her face. Because we need you. There it was. The truth. My parents had never needed anyone before. They had always been the ones people came to, the ones people relied on. But now, without the financial support of their children, without their carefully curated social image, they were drowning. And they wanted me to throw them a lifeline. I stared at them, my heart hammering. After everything they had done, after humiliating my daughter, belittling my husband, and treating me like an embarrassment, they wanted me to save them? Daniel must have sensed what I was thinking because he stood, stepping beside me. You don't deserve her help, he said flatly. Not after what you did to her. To Lily. My mother's lips trembled. I know, she whispered. I know we don't deserve it. I exhaled slowly. Lily's voice drifted from down the hall, soft and innocent, completely unaware of the storm raging just outside her room. I turned back to my parents, something solidifying inside me. You want help? My voice was calm, steady. Then here are my terms. Eleanor's head snapped up, eyes widening slightly. Terms? Yes, I said firmly. If you want any place in my life, in Lily's life, it's on my terms. Not yours. Charles tensed. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to be in our lives, it's going to be as family, not as some distant aristocrats looking down on us. I met my mother's gaze. You will not treat Lily as anything less than your granddaughter. You will not exclude her. You will not dismiss my marriage or my life because it doesn't fit your version of success. Eleanor's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Charles, however, bristled. Olivia, be reasonable. Reasonable? I let out a sharp laugh. You humiliated a 6-year-old child on Christmas Eve. You let her open an empty box while the rest of her cousins got showered with expensive gifts. You watched her face fall, watched her heart break, and you smirked, Mother. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. You knew exactly what you were doing, I continued, my voice shaking with fury. So no, Father, I am not going to be reasonable. I am going to be a mother. And that means protecting my daughter from you. Silence. Thick, heavy silence. Then, a small voice broke through it. Grandma? I turned sharply, my heart stalling. Lily stood in the hallway, her small form framed by the soft glow of her nightlight. She clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest, blinking sleepily. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Lily. My daughter hesitated, then looked directly at my mother. Why don't you like me? Eleanor's breath hitched. The weight of that simple, innocent question hit harder than anything I could have said. Tears welled in my mother's eyes, her carefully constructed walls shattering. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something I had never seen before. Regret. Real, raw, unfiltered regret. She dropped to her knees, her perfect posture forgotten. Lily, her voice cracked. I was wrong. Lily tilted her head, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her stuffed rabbit. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. And in the purest, most innocent act of forgiveness, she held out her red sweater. You can borrow this if you're cold, Grandma. Eleanor broke. She sobbed, truly, truly sobbed, as she reached for Lily, holding her as if she were something fragile, something she had never truly seen before. And as I watched, as I felt Daniel's warm hand find mine, I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. But it would be on my terms. On Lily's terms. And nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that filled the room was thick, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of years of hurt. Eleanor clung to Lily as if holding her could somehow erase everything, as if the warmth of my daughter's tiny body could melt away decades of coldness. I had never seen my mother cry like this. Not when I had left Wellington Hills to marry Daniel. Not when I had been absent from family gatherings for years. Not even when she had humiliated my daughter on Christmas Eve. But now, here, kneeling before Lily, the woman who had once been the embodiment of composure and pride was utterly broken. Lily's tiny fingers gently patted Eleanor's shoulder, her innocence unable to fully grasp the depth of what was happening. It's okay, Grandma, she said softly, her voice laced with quiet comfort. But it wasn't okay. Not yet. I forced myself to inhale deeply, steadying my voice as I spoke. Crying doesn't change the past, Mother. Eleanor's sobs quieted slightly, but she didn't lift her head. Her hands trembled as she smoothed Lily's red sweater, as if it were something precious, something she had never truly appreciated before. I know, she whispered. I know it doesn't. Charles stood behind her, his expression unreadable, his normally stern face drawn with something I had never seen before, shame. He didn't know what to do, how to react. His world had always been so structured, so carefully built on appearances and control. And now, that control was gone. I swallowed the lump in my throat. You don't get to just cry and expect everything to be different. Eleanor lifted her head then, her face blotchy with tears. I don't, she admitted. Her voice, so often cool and controlled, cracked under the weight of emotion. I don't expect that. Lily stepped back, and Eleanor let her go hesitantly, her hands lingering in the air as if she wasn't ready to break contact. Daniel moved beside me, his presence solid, unwavering. I felt his silent support, his quiet strength. This was my battle to fight, but I wasn't alone. Charles finally spoke, his voice rough. We failed you, Olivia. A bitter laugh escaped me. That's an understatement. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. We were wrong. About you. About Daniel. About Lily. He exhaled, as if admitting it cost him something. We see that now. I folded my arms. And? Eleanor's hands curled into fists on her lap. And we want to make it right. I let out a slow breath, the anger in my chest still simmering. Do you even know what right looks like? Silence. For so long, my parents had defined their love through conditions, through expectations that were impossible to meet. Their version of right had never included me as I was. It had only included the version of me they wished I had been. Eleanor shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. No. It was the first honest thing she had ever said to me. I turned slightly, glancing at Lily. She was watching us with wide, uncertain eyes, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. This wasn't just about me, it was about her. I crouched down, brushing a loose curl from her face. Sweetheart, can you go upstairs for a little bit? Daddy will come up in a minute. Lily hesitated, her gaze flickering to Eleanor before returning to me. Are you mad, Mommy? My throat tightened. I'm just making sure we understand each other. She nodded slowly, then turned to Daniel. He scooped her up easily, pressing a kiss to her forehead before carrying her upstairs. She glanced over his shoulder once more before disappearing down the hall. And then it was just the three of us. I turned back to my parents. You don't get to just walk back into our lives and expect forgiveness overnight. It doesn't work like that. Eleanor's fingers twisted in the fabric of her coat. I know. You don't know, I snapped. You have no idea how much damage you've done. To me. To Lily. She asked me, before we even arrived at Wellington Hills, if you wanted her there. A 6-year-old child, wondering if she even belonged in her own family. Eleanor's breath hitched. Charles looked away, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. But he didn't defend himself. You didn't just hurt me, I continued, my voice steady. You hurt her. And I will never let that happen again. Eleanor nodded quickly, wiping at her face. We'll do whatever it takes. I studied her, searching for any sign of manipulation, of insincerity. But all I saw was exhaustion. Regret. Good. You want a relationship with Lily? I said, my voice firm. Then you earn it. You show up. You put in the effort. You prove that you love her for who she is, not for who you think she should be. Eleanor nodded frantically, as if she had been waiting for the opportunity. Yes. Yes, of course. I turned my gaze to my father. And you? Charles met my eyes, his expression unreadable. I will do whatever you ask, Olivia. I arched a brow. Even if it means admitting that money doesn't buy love? He hesitated, but only for a second. Then, slowly, he nodded. I exhaled, feeling the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. We start small, I said. Visits on our terms. No gifts to make up for the past, no extravagant gestures. Just time. Eleanor swallowed hard. Time. Yes. I took a step back, putting distance between us. That's all I'm willing to give you right now. Eleanor opened her mouth, but for once, she didn't argue. Charles ran a hand down his face, his body visibly sagging as if the fight had drained out of him. Thank you, he said quietly. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to say you're welcome. Not yet. Go home, I said instead. We'll talk soon. Eleanor hesitated, but then, slowly, she nodded. Charles reached for the doorknob, pausing just before stepping out. He turned back, his gaze settling on me with something almost uncertain. You built a good home, Olivia. My throat tightened, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. Yes, I did. And I didn't need them to do it. With that, they stepped out into the cold, disappearing into the night. I shut the door and locked it, exhaling deeply before pressing my forehead against the wood. Daniel's voice drifted from behind me. You okay? I turned, finding him standing at the base of the stairs. His eyes were filled with quiet understanding. I let out a slow breath, nodding. I think so. He crossed the room and pulled me into his arms, his embrace warm, steady. I'm proud of you. I closed my eyes, sinking into him. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, it felt like we were moving forward. And that was enough. Days passed. Then a week. True to my word, I set the terms. There were no lavish apologies, no extravagant gifts meant to smooth over the years of damage. Just time. Charles and Eleanor had been stripped of their carefully built world of wealth and prestige, and for the first time in their lives, they had no choice but to meet me where I was. Not on their terms. Not in their world. But in mine. And so, our first meeting outside of that disastrous Christmas night wasn't in a grand estate or an expensive restaurant. It was in a small, local cafe. I arrived first with Lily, choosing a quiet booth near the window. She sat across from me, her little hands curled around a cup of hot chocolate, the marshmallows slowly melting into the dark liquid. She was nervous. I could tell by the way she kept glancing at the door, by the way her fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic mug. I reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Hey, I said softly. You okay, sweetheart? Lily hesitated, then nodded. I think so. I knew she was still processing everything. Children were resilient, but they weren't blind. She had seen the way she was treated that night at Wellington Hills. She had felt the coldness, the exclusion. And while I had made it clear that things were going to change, a part of her still wasn't sure. She had every right to be unsure. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and I turned to see them. My parents stood in the doorway, looking out of place in the cozy, unpretentious setting. Eleanor had traded her designer coat for something simpler, though she still carried herself with the same air of careful refinement. Charles looked the most uncomfortable, his sharp eyes scanning the cafe as if expecting someone to recognize them and whisper about how far they had fallen. But no one cared. No one turned to gawk at them. Because here, they weren't the elite Charles and Eleanor Carter. They were just two people trying to mend something they had broken. Eleanor spotted us first and nudged my father before approaching the table. She hesitated just before sitting, her eyes flickering to Lily. "Hello, sweetheart." Lily stared at her for a long moment, her small hands tightening around her mug. "Hi," she said finally. Eleanor sat slowly, her movements careful, uncertain. My father followed, his expression unreadable. I let the silence stretch, waiting to see what they would do. Finally, Eleanor cleared her throat. I wasn't sure what to bring," she admitted. "I thought about getting something, but I remembered what you said, Olivia. So I didn't." She folded her hands in her lap, looking uncharacteristically small. "I just came." I studied her, trying to gauge if there was any lingering expectation in her words. But for once, she seemed genuine. "Good," I said simply. She nodded. The silence stretched again, and I could feel the tension in Lily's small frame. Then, unexpectedly, my father spoke. "Lily," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "Do you like baseball?" Lily blinked, caught off guard. "Baseball?" "Yes." My father shifted slightly, his fingers tapping the table as if the conversation itself was unfamiliar territory for him. "Your cousin Nathan plays, doesn't he?" Lily nodded slowly. "Yeah. I never liked it myself," Charles admitted, exhaling. "Too slow. But I think I'd like watching you play." Lily tilted her head, her expression wary but curious. "I don't play." "Well," my father said, leaning forward slightly. "If you ever want to, I'd be happy to come to a game. If you'd let me." Lily was quiet, studying him as if trying to figure out whether or not he was serious. Eleanor shifted slightly. "We don't expect you to trust us right away, sweetheart," she said softly. "But we want to try." Lily stared at them for a long time. Then, cautiously, she lifted her mug and took a small sip of hot chocolate. "I like soccer better," she said finally. My father's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but something close. "Soccer, then." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't an instant fix. But it was a start. The weeks that followed were strange, filled with hesitant meetings and awkward conversations. My parents, once so powerful in their own world, were now navigating unfamiliar ground. They had to earn their place, and for the first time, they seemed to understand that. They didn't try to overwhelm Lily with gifts. They didn't try to buy their way back in. Instead, they did something much harder. They showed up. Charles attended one of Lily's soccer practices, standing stiffly at the sidelines, clearly uncomfortable but watching nonetheless. Eleanor sat with me, bundled in a scarf, sipping tea from a thermos as she asked careful, gentle questions about Lily's interests. And little by little, Lily started to respond. She didn't forgive them overnight. She didn't immediately throw herself into their arms. But she started to let them in. One evening, after my mother had left from a short visit, Lily turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Mommy?" I tucked her into bed, brushing her curls from her face. "Yes, sweetheart." She hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "Is Grandma different now?" I swallowed. "She's trying to be." Lily thought about that. "Do you believe her?" That was a harder question. Did I believe that my parents had truly changed? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing for certain. "I believe that people can change," I said finally. "If they really want to." Lily nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. Then, hesitantly, she whispered, "Do you think she loves me now?" The question nearly broke me. I cupped her small face gently. "Sweetheart, she should have always loved you. But if she's finally realizing how special you are, then that's her mistake for taking so long." Lily studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." She snuggled deeper into her blankets, closing her eyes. Mommy? Yes, love. I think I want to give her a chance. I exhaled slowly, feeling something settle in my chest. Then we'll do that, I whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn my parents' love. I was letting them earn ours. Spring arrived with a quiet gentleness, bringing with it crisp mornings and the scent of blooming flowers. The air was lighter, the heaviness of winter fading into something softer, something full of possibility. And in many ways, the change in season mirrored the shift within my family. It had been months since that disastrous Christmas gathering, months since I had walked out of Wellington Hills with Lily's hand in mine, vowing never to return to a place where she wasn't wanted. But now, things were different. Not perfect. Not seamless. But different. Lily was laughing more these days. Not the hesitant, uncertain giggles she used to give around my parents, but real, uninhibited joy. She still carried the memory of that night, but it no longer held the same weight over her. And my parents? They had changed. Slowly, unevenly, but changed nonetheless. It was evident in the way my father now called me Olivia Carter, no longer erasing the name that connected me to my husband. It was evident in the way my mother no longer held herself with the cold, calculated distance she once did, but instead moved with careful, deliberate warmth when she was around Lily. And it was most evident today, as my father stood on the sidelines of Lily's soccer game, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, watching intently. I sat beside Eleanor in the stands, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, my gaze shifting between Lily and my mother. This was her first time attending one of Lily's games, and though she didn't say much, I could tell she was watching, really watching. Lily was easy to spot on the field, her red jersey standing out against the green grass. She moved with effortless energy, chasing the ball with determination, her little legs pumping hard as she sprinted toward the goal. "She's good," Eleanor murmured beside me. I glanced at her. She wasn't looking at me, but at Lily, a small, almost wistful smile on her face. "She is," I agreed, feeling a warmth in my chest. Silence stretched between us, comfortable yet uncertain. There were still things left unsaid, still wounds that couldn't be mended overnight. But this quiet acknowledgement of my daughter's worth was a step in the right direction. Charles, who had remained quiet for most of the game, suddenly called out, "Come on, Lily. Go for it." I turned, startled. My father was cheering. It was subtle, nothing like the grand, booming voice he used at social events, but it was there. Lily, hearing her grandfather's voice, glanced toward the sideline. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. But then, she grinned. And then she scored. The crowd erupted in cheers, parents clapping, kids high-fiving. Lily's teammates swarmed around her in celebration, but it was my father she looked at first. Charles Carter, the man who had once refused to acknowledge her existence, raised his hand in an awkward but unmistakable thumbs up. Lily's face lit up. And just like that, something shifted. That evening, we gathered at my home for a small dinner, something casual, something that felt more like a family than the carefully curated events my parents were used to. Daniel grilled outside while Lily sat at the kitchen table, drawing something with intense focus. Eleanor stood beside me, watching as I set the table. "I never expected this," she admitted softly. I paused, glancing at her. "Expected what?" She hesitated, her hands smoothing the fabric of the napkins. "To be here. To be part of this." I studied her carefully. "You didn't think we'd give you a chance?" She exhaled. "I didn't think we deserved one." Honesty. Real honesty. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "You still have a long way to go, Mother." She nodded, looking down. "I know." Lily suddenly hopped down from her chair, running toward us. She held up her drawing, her face beaming with pride. "Look, I made this for Grandpa." Eleanor took the paper, her eyes scanning the drawing. It was a childlike but unmistakable picture, Lily in her soccer uniform, kicking a ball toward a figure that, though somewhat scribbled, clearly resembled Charles. Above them, in big, wobbly letters, were the words "Thank you for cheering for me, Grandpa." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, carefully, she lowered her hand, blinking away what I was certain were tears. "He's going to love this," she whispered. Lily grinned. "Do you think so?" "I know so," Eleanor said, her voice steadier now. And for the first time, I saw it, truly saw it. My mother loved Lily. Maybe she always had, in her own warped, misguided way. But now, for the first time, it wasn't hidden behind social expectations or family pride. It was real. And it was enough. Later that night, after my parents had left, I sat on the porch with Daniel, the cool spring air wrapping around us. "How do you feel?" he asked, taking a sip of his drink. I sighed, letting my head rest against his shoulder. "I don't know. Lighter, maybe?" He chuckled. "That's a good sign." I turned slightly, looking up at him. "Do you think they've really changed?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled. "I think they're trying to." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so too." Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the heavy kind. It was the kind that came with understanding, with knowing that even though things weren't perfect, they were better. Lily suddenly appeared in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mommy? Daddy?" Daniel smiled, holding out an arm for her. "What is it, sweetheart?" She climbed onto his lap, curling into his warmth. "I just wanted to say, today was nice." I wrapped an arm around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yeah, baby." It was. She yawned, her eyes drifting closed. "Grandpa smiled today," she murmured sleepily. Like, really smiled. I met Daniel's gaze over Lily's head, something unspoken passing between us. Growth. Change. Healing. Lily shifted slightly, her voice barely a whisper now. "I think I like having grandparents." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I just held my daughter close, knowing that whatever happened next, whatever the future held, this time, she would never feel unwanted again. Because now, she wasn't just tolerated. She was loved. And that was all that truly mattered.